Welcome, my name's Kara-Leah from the Yoga Lunchbox, and today I have with me Matthew Remski. Matthew is a Canadian-based writer, therapist, and yoga teacher. He writes about yoga, Ayurveda, and also evolution. You may have read his book or seen his book Threads of Yoga, which is a remixed rendering of the Yoga Sutras. But we're here to talk about his latest book project, which is called What Are We Actually Doing in Asana? Welcome, Matthew.
Thanks a lot, Kara-Leah. It's a pleasure to be with you.
It's great to have you on because I've been following this project since you launched it in January, and I don't think I've ever seen as much dialogue and discussion and response to a yoga thread anywhere in social media or on the net. It's been incredible. Were you surprised at the response to this project?
Part of me was surprised at the response, but in another way, the book is really emerging out of about 6 or 7 years of concern. So just to give a little bit of background, I've been teaching asana for about 12 years. I've been a community organizer here in Toronto for the yoga community for 4 or 5 years. And then I've also been an Ayurvedic therapist, mainly serving yoga students and yoga teachers here in Toronto. And that's maybe 8 years or so. And what I've noticed, or what I have noticed as a through line throughout all of that time, is that it's very rare to come across anybody who speaks about their practice life as being injury-free. Now, for several years, I chalked this up to, just sloppy instruction and people pushing themselves too hard, and that conveniently allowed me to divide people up into, groups that get it and groups that don't get it. And it's a lot more complicated than that. And I think that actually, I have a toddler. He's 21 months old, and my wife Alex is also a yoga teacher. And so about 2 years ago, she's in her third trimester, coming into her third trimester, and she's, drawing back her teaching responsibilities a little bit, and I am too, because I'm shifting over into more lecturing and so on. And it gave us the time and space to actually speak about some of these experiences a little bit more transparently, and to start asking questions about the overall success of the yoga project with regard to keeping people safe and fulfilling its promise of being a therapeutic and healing modality. So it was really, it's been a long time coming, and so when I finally opened the floodgate in January on social media, I was gratified at the transparency of the response, at the magnitude of the response. I wasn't entirely surprised. I think there are many people who are really wanting to tell their stories of pain, discomfort, injury, but then also recovery through asana. And I really want to emphasize that. This isn't a project in debunking or in flag waving or in micromanaging. It's a project in figuring out what has been not working for people, and then trying to also tell the stories that they generate positively moving forward out of their adversity.
So in January, you put a call up on Facebook, didn't you, saying, have you been injured through your asana practice? And you've had, 50, 60, 70 responses for people who wanted to be interviewed?
Well, no, I've had several hundred responses, long stories by email, very detailed chat messages through chat conversations through Facebook, people contacting me by phone. It's been hundreds of responses, and from those hundreds of responses, I have compiled about 80 interviews now. And I would say I haven't done the stats on them yet, but I would say that about 60 of those interviews cover stories of injury and recovery, and their contexts, both psychological, social, and also pedagogical. How were these people being instructed? What kind of studio environments were they in? What kind of safety procedures were in place? What kind of relationships were they able to generate with their teachers and with their peers? That kind of thing. So there's about 2/3 of the stories flow along within that category, and the other third of the interviews that I've done are with people who have specialist or expertise knowledge to add to the discussion, primarily specialists in biomechanics, osteopaths. I interviewed somebody who I think is going to be very important in this discussion, whose name is Jules Mitchell. She just submitted her master's degree thesis in the science of stretching, which, believe it or not, is something that nobody's ever done before. There isn't a lot of graduate work on all aspects of the science of stretching, especially as applied to yoga movement vocabulary. And a number of other experts as well. On the docket, too, I'll be speaking to a number of yoga scholars. Some of them are friends of mine. Some of them I've got to reach out to and try to make contact with and interest them in this project. And so I'm trying to do two things at once. I'm trying to cultivate research from people who have been doing work in the asana injury field for a long time, and a lot of the time these folks have been relatively isolated and kind of voices in the wilderness. But then the main part of the book is really to present and then to analyze what people actually describe about their injuries, how they felt, what their relationships to pain were and are. And all of this very, very subtle, subjective, confusing, conflictual stuff that I think we all go through when we're learning about the mystery of our bodies.
Now, I put a call out yesterday just saying I'm going to be doing this interview, and if you're not familiar with Matthew's work, here's some links, and what do you think about it? And two people came back to me and basically said, what do you mean he's researching injuries in asana? If people are getting injured doing yoga, they're not actually doing yoga, so it's a moot point.
I'm glad that you got that response, because I think it's a very weak version of the no true Scotsman fallacy, which is no true Scotsman would behave like that. I can't remember what the joke is, but it's basically we set up a circumstance in which somebody says that they are practicing yoga in earnest. Because they injure themselves, we tell them that they are a liar. We tell them that they aren't practicing at all. And I have met and talked to too many absolutely sincere, dedicated, devotional practitioners of asana who have been injured not because they can identify themselves as pushing themselves too far, not because they have necessarily been injured by incompetent or invasive adjustments, but because they have done something with joy that was maladaptive and they didn't know it. And so this whole argument that if yoga hurts, it isn't yoga, or if somebody gets injured, then they weren't actually doing yoga because yoga is a mindfulness technique. That I think with respect to your readers, I think that's actually insulting to people who practice in good faith and in earnestness and wind up injured anyway. I'll give you a good example of this. I've talked to several practitioners who have ascended the highest levels of training in their fields, and who also have, I'd say, been interdisciplinary in their practices. It's not as though they're just asana junkies or specialists. They've also been very interested in deep practitioners of meditation, of pranayama, of bhakti yoga. And these are people who have injured themselves through repetitive stress that they couldn't feel because it was impacting their cartilage, specifically their hip cartilage. I'm thinking of a couple of practitioners who have bilateral labral tears, which come from repetitive forward folding with or without bent knees. This is not about straining the hamstrings. This is about coming to the end range of motion, compressing the cartilage, which is not innervated, and slowly breaking it down to the point at which it suddenly collapses and causes intense pain. And so often an argument or a detractor to my project will say, well, if the person is in pain, they aren't actually doing yoga, and that's completely rubbish, actually, because there are all kinds of postures and movements that we can do that are actually damaging to non-innervated tissues like cartilage that have nothing to do with that don't broadcast feelings. I think what we're trapped in yoga culture is this rather myopic belief that if internally we feel that things are all right, that they should be all right. Well, it's a little bit more complex than that. I myself was practicing beyond or into and against end range of motion until I was actually told not to. And it was only because I was told not to by somebody who knew. It wasn't that it felt bad. It wasn't that I was in pain. But I was told and then convinced by somebody who had evidence that what I was doing was actually statistically dangerous. And so, anyway, I'm as you can tell, I'm quite impassioned about those particular detractions.
But this is an important point, though, isn't it?
And I really want to be clear that they're not sufficient, and they go a little bit farther than that. I think they blame the victim a little bit.
Okay. So what you're saying is that it's possible to, so cartilage, that word you use, sorry, I'm not familiar with it, but I'm guessing it means there's no nerves in there, so you can't actually feel the damage you're doing?
If your hip cartilage was innervated, was yes.
So innervated means no nerves in it. I mean, innervated,
no, if it had nerves in it, you would be in constant pain because it is translating hundreds of pounds of force with every step. Your cartilage is designed to actually protect you from sensation in the hips and in the shoulders and wherever else, and in the spine. And when it is compressed, when it is whittled away, let's say by going to bone-on-bone compression, or towards end range and to end range motion in a regular way, it begins to deteriorate, fair and simple. And as it deteriorates, it doesn't give sensation.
Right.
And that's a real problem. That alone should tell the smart yogi that while we value internal intelligence, the whole interoceptive sense of what's happening within us, we also have to reach out to people who actually know something about the body more than we do. And so part of what this research is sort of directing me towards is well, who has that specific knowledge? And now that specific knowledge around biomechanical safety may not be coming from a place of yogic orthodoxy, right? And so people will say, well, it's concerned with the body only, or it's materialistic, or it's scientific, and yoga is intuitive, or yoga has its own science, or a number of ways that people can kind of resist this information. But I would never say that biomechanics intelligence would be any substitute for mindfulness. I would just say that it needs to supplement it. We can be very mindfully practicing and in utter possession of our sensations and our faculties, and we could be doing things that are unhealthy for us. And I don't say this to make people paranoid. I say this to help yoga culture in general to ask for higher standards in education.
So what are we actually doing in asana practice? Because when you peel it back, there's this, and I've been asking this myself, like I've been practicing for 10 or 15 years, and at the moment I am sort of asking myself, why am I doing this stuff all the time, 90 minutes a day when I do it? Why am I doing this? What is it actually for? When you're going past the range of movement that you might need in a day-to-day life, for example. So what are we actually doing?
Well, the title of my book, my eventual book, is a little bit of a joke because it can't be answered. There are too many objectives that people express when they move towards asana practice. There's too many goals that people hold. There are the diversity of types of practice is extraordinary. But I'll give a couple of themes that I think are really pertinent. One is people want to treasure or want to be remembered to their sense of environment, or sense of embodiment, rather. People want to feel as connected with movement and with breath as they did when they were children. They want to feel an ease and a buoyancy in relationship to gravity that may feel long in the past. They want to feel as though the compression of life can somehow be re-expanded and be a source of wonderment again. And I think that's what hooks people to begin with. And that's why if people delve into the psychology and philosophy of yoga after that initial contact point through the real grace of asana, I think they start finding some deeper resonances as well. But then there's a shadow to every therapy and to every desire. And one of the shadows that's emerging through this research is that often people's quest for embodiment is also a quest to negotiate their sense of dissociation. And by doing that, people can actually move towards actively desiring to feel strong sensation, even pain, as a way of almost validating their presence in the world. People can move into asana because it is a safer way of feeling the discomfort that they felt in a chaotic way, perhaps during a traumatic situation in the past. People will move into asana because they have strong perfectionist tendencies, and asana seems to be a way, at least in the way it's language that's presented in the media, asana seems to be a way in which they can present or they can enact their perfectionist tendencies in a socially acceptable or a virtuous way. People can, going back to discomfort for a moment, I think an incredible point that actually almost unleashed this whole project within me was that I was sitting with a good friend of mine named Scott. He wrote a book with me way back called Yoga 2.0. And he's finishing up doing his degree in psychodynamic psychotherapy. And he said to me, just over coffee as we're talking about injuries, he said, well, you know, if a person wanted to hurt themselves, if they wanted to feel pain, asana would be a very socially acceptable way of doing it. And that just kind of blew my mind, because it made me realize that what we're talking about with injury, and especially repetitive stress injury in asana, is a whole field of subjectivity on the part of informants, where we don't really know how other people are experiencing pain or what it means to them. And the possibility that pain has actually a value to some people just blew my mind, and it blew my mind in the sense that it was very resonant, because I had felt it myself, actually. Not in a serious way. I was never a compulsive practitioner, but I did go through several stages in my intensive asana career in which I did consciously painful or uncomfortable things every day, as a way of well, I think I was distracting myself from some emotional turmoil. I think that I was trying to revitalize myself from a sense of depression, and actually feeling pain in my body was better than feeling nothing at all. But then also, I saw it as almost a transcendent test that, Hanumanasana, which I just cannot do because the heads of my femurs and the positions of my acetabulum on both sides won't allow me to do the posture. Like I will not ever be able to do. I will physically never be able to do a forward splitting pose. But I worked on it for a year or more, every single day, and I had this sense that the pose held a secret for me, that if I could reach for that much more openness, if I could relax my pain response that much more, I would become a different type of person. And there is some reasonability to that because we do have the capacity to alter our perceptions and our tolerance for pain. I think a great resource for this is to read Benjamin Lohr's Hellbent, about his entire experience in the Bikram yoga competitive community, especially his experiences around backbending. He describes approaching and moving towards pain as something that was interesting, some part of himself that he wanted to investigate. And something also that he doesn't quite say this, but I imagine was also more real than anything else at that time in his life. So I think it's extraordinarily complicated what we're actually doing in asana, but in the end, on the whole, I would say we are learning about ourselves. It just isn't all roses.
Because there is that assumption that we go to yoga to heal injury, and that you won't hurt yourself in yoga if you do it right, if you listen, if you pay attention, right?
That's a huge assumption.
So that there's a huge assumption that's kind of driving what we do, is that it is good for us to keep stretching, and if we just listen to ourselves and our own intuition, we won't hurt ourselves.
Yeah, it's a huge assumption, and I think it's an assumption that is supported by people's initial honeymoon experience with asana. People come into the first 6 months or the first year of their practices and feel such tremendous physiological and emotional benefits that they attribute to the postures or the breathing or the community itself. And I think it gets very complicated because those actual returns on practice are usually unsustainable. I don't have any evidence for this, but just anecdotally from my years of experience, I would say that most people feel as though they reach a plateau in terms of physiological payback, physical gains and advances in mobility and stability after about 3 years of practice. And the thing is if they continue doing what they're doing, in order to chase the sensations that they felt at the beginning of practice, and they aren't given any other options, or somehow they feel that if they stop doing what they're doing, their lives will collapse. Some people end up practicing quite addictively. Then that's where repetitive stress injury begins, I believe, to soar in terms of its occurrence. So, yeah, I would say that there's a therapeutic allure, and certainly this is bolstered by the marketing. Everywhere you look, we are told that yoga is a healing practice, and lo and behold, when we first enter into it, that is the majority experience. Having said that, I will also say that yoga culture is profoundly ignorant as to the numbers of people that walk into 1 or 2 classes, feel as though they get injured in those one or two classes, and then they never come back again. Because we just don't keep records on people who don't come back because they don't pay us, right? So the research on how many people enter into a studio environment, into classroom environments, and then leave immediately because it's painful, to do some more searching into as well. But I would say that for the people who stay, and the people who stay are the ones who end up producing all of the advertising, the majority experience is of a honeymoon period at the beginning, and then a kind of plateau that feels wrong, and so it's something that a person will struggle against, and in that struggle, I think, lies the root of the majority of repetitive stress.
So, because we're always looking to attain more, go further, go deeper.
Well, I think going deeper is an encouragement towards a memory. Go deeper into your practice is a call out to try to regenerate the experience that you first had. And the thing about blissful experiences is that they rarely happen the same way twice. And it's because it's the way our neurology is built. The deepest pleasure that we have is through learning, and the deepest pleasure that we have is through novelty. And so when we learn a new movement, or we learn a new sensation, or we learn a new sensation, a feeling of spaciousness within the body, that is a thrill. And that thrill will never be as intense, or its intensity will fade over time. And what we have to do is make sure that something else is there to catch our attention, something a little bit more subtle, something that doesn't require as much effort. Because honestly, as we progress through our asana careers, we should be applying less effort rather than more. I mean, if it is therapeutic, we should be applying less effort rather than more, I would say.
One thing I thought that was interesting is a majority of your subjects said that they express gratitude for their injury experience. So even though they're having injuries, their relationship to those injuries was mostly one of gratitude.
Yeah, and this is where I hope that the the real storm of negative attention that I'm sure this book will get is placated, because I'm very serious about seeing injury as a learning path, and not in this platitudinous way that sort of people are just written off through incompetent teaching. I mean, there are many people who tell me, "Oh yeah, my teacher said that injuries are learning experiences, but then they didn't really tell me how to learn through them." I'm talking about people who generally went through a period of deep disillusionment with the type of practice they were doing, perhaps the instructors they were learning from, perhaps the studio environment and the culture, the sociology of practice, and who nonetheless persevered because they loved being embodied and mindful in that way that yoga can provide, and so they went on to figure something else out. My job in this book is to find those stories. I consider that to be part of my job anyway, and to really highlight them as exemplary for those who want yoga education to improve.
So what you're kind of doing is busting this myth that yoga is purely therapeutic, and this myth that if you are just tuned in enough, you won't injure yourself.
Yes.
In a way, and saying there's way more to it than that. It's really complex. The fact is, if you practice continually for a long period of time, you're quite likely to injure yourself.
Yes.
And that in itself is part of the learning experience, and it's not, I don't want to say it's a bad thing. Obviously, if we can avoid injuring ourselves, that would be the ideal, right? But
it would absolutely be the ideal. I think there's a lot of injuries that are avoidable. Now, I don't think that this project is going to do away with yoga injuries, because I would say that of all of the causes, I mean, I've looked at cause is a difficult word because you can't prove causation in yoga injuries. But I would say that of all of the correlations that I've looked at so far, thematically, we have the psychology of overwork, the psychology of wanting to please, whether instructors or other people in the room, the psychology of wanting to position oneself in a certain way towards authority. We have the sociology of group effort. We have a media fascination with the visual beauty of asana that encourages people to focus upon external aesthetics rather than internal dynamics. And then we have huge pedagogical gaps. Teachers who are going around telling people that pain is an opening, that knee injury is a sign of your body reorganizing itself, or the pain in your shoulder is karma, or a number. I mean, just there's a boatload of inane things that uneducated people are telling students because they don't know what else to say, I think, and maybe they genuinely feel bad that the person in front of them is in pain, and they want to offer them something, but it ends up being pap. And So amongst all of these correlations, I think the primary thing that stands out is what I would call the overinflation of, like, a kind of presumptuous knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
usually on the part of teachers, that their intuitive instincts are able, through their intuitive instincts, they're able to see into their students' experiences. They can tell when people are healthy. They can tell when people are not healthy. They can tell what movements are good for them because they studied light on yoga. There's a real knowledge gap, but the problem with the knowledge gap in yoga education is that a whole bunch of spiritual and psychological wisdom principles can float in on top of that biomechanics knowledge gap and make it seem small or irrelevant. But I think by exposing these stories in as plain spoken and as passionate a manner in which they're told to me, I don't hope to eradicate injuries, but I do hope to smarten the conversation up, especially within training programs, and also leave a future generation of yoga practitioners a real body of experiential knowledge to look at and to learn from and to use to examine their own experience with. The other reason that I'd say that injuries are not going to go away is just going back to the subjectivity of pain and the needs of pain, the values of pain that people have because of various circumstances and conditions. Injury is not going to go anywhere because we have, as human beings, an ambivalent relationship to pain. We use it. We don't entirely try to avoid it. And we attribute meaning to it. And sometimes we would attribute religious and spiritual meaning to it. And it's not my job to debunk that, but to just make it transparent and visible so that it can become a choice. Because if you grew up in let's say a spiritual or religious environment in which you were told that suffering was virtuous, in which you were told that look, here is somebody who was crucified for your sins, and the pain that he went through was for you, and that is given to you as an image of transcendent grace, you may have a very complex relationship with pain. And I'm not saying that that relationship is ill or is unworthy in some way. My job, I feel, is to make that relationship transparent so that it then becomes a choice. I think that people are can very intelligently use spiritual themes and mythology to understand and navigate their inevitable experience of pain in life. So my objective is to not take that away from anybody, but to simply expose it so that it can be more clear.
It's probably because this, to my knowledge, hasn't necessarily been clearly spoken about in the yoga world before, that we injure ourselves with repetitive yoga over long periods of time, and it's just what happens, and it does happen. Like the story you told about Diane, I won't go in depth into that right now, but Diane, and a practitioner in Canada who's been practicing for a long time, very well, and
at the top of her field and loved by hundreds, if not thousands.
Yeah, and she's got an intuitive awareness of what's going on, and yet still a serious injury as a result of all of that practice and a few key things. The fact that you're bringing these stories to the forefront, I've been doing Ashtanga for the last 6 months, and it's a practice I've just picked up simply because the teachers are very, very good.
Right.
And because I've been reading your work, I'm so much more aware going through this practice of what's being told to me and how I'm taking it on board. So when my knees started to feel it a bit, and I was told that's just part of the process and it's just an opening, and I actually went, well, hang on, is that true? Because I'd read your work, but maybe 3-4 months prior to that, I wouldn't have questioned what I was being told.
Yeah. Well, so what do you? Let me ask you a question. I know you're interviewing me, but when you're told that's part of the process, what do you think the objective is on the part of the teacher? What are they trying to say to you?
From my feeling, the teacher who told me that's what they had been told. and they don't really know. So they're just passing on what they were told. So it's just passed on knowledge.
All right, so there can be a telephone game aspect to it.
Yeah, absolutely. They didn't really have a direct understanding of what was going on.
Okay, but if you trace that all the way back to the first person who said that for the first student, what do you imagine that could mean?
Well, perhaps the first person who said it, that's what they might have experienced in their particular practice, is it was part of the process for them, and it came and then it went and it shifted. Doesn't necessarily mean it applies to the other person, or it just could simply mean they don't know what's going on, and so they just attribute it to the process.
Yeah. Well, Kara-Leah, I mean, I guess what I'm digging at here is that there's a claim being made with that statement, which is, first of all, that there's a process. And the implication of that claim is that there's an arrival point, or there's a goal. And so I'm wondering. My question is, what's on the other side of an injured knee? Like,
openness, freedom.
Well, but this is what this is where I mean, I want to be careful here because I don't want to imply that that's crazy. Because it's not crazy from the perspective of traditional hatha yoga, which in its literature and its practice for hundreds of years has advised austere and sometimes self-mortifying practices towards the specific objective of creating a kind of mystical body. And this is at odds with our notion, or the general global notion nowadays of therapy, that you actually take care of your tissues so that they serve you well for a long life. So when I hear, your knee pain moving towards a knee injury is something that you just have to go through as a process, what I hear on the other end of that process is a very old goal, which is your knee will become a post-human knee. Your knee will become a magical knee that will never get injured again because you broke it out of its gross form. Something like that, right?
So you're transcending the body through not identifying with it anymore and not caring if it's injured or not, because it's irrelevant, because you are not your body, right?
Exactly. All of those metaphysical claims get carried in there. Now we can have our feelings about those claims, but I definitely have my own strong opinions about the value of those claims, but stepping back and being a little bit more analytical, a little bit more, religious studies scholar about it on my part, it's really the objective is to make those worldviews plain, to take a statement like it's part of the process, and to ask the questions that unpack what that actually means in terms of its claims and expectations. Because I think that's the whole ballgame. There's all kinds of things that we're telling ourselves as teachers and students of yoga, and telling each other as teachers and students of yoga, that are very elliptical. They're very strange. They have mystical overtones. And the thing about mystical language is it has a way of stopping the conversation. Because, if you, as you described, yourself four months ago might have heard, it's part of the process, as a way of being told, there are more things that are in the universe that are dreamt of by you right now, right? But there's more to come. The process has a capital P to it. Now, it might be that there's some, fantastic cosmic journey that you're about to take, and I'm not one to say that you aren't, but there's a difference between just being told that and then asking, well, where is it going to take me? What's it going to do?
What's actually going on?
Yeah.
Just that. We'll just touch on that what you said about the origins of hatha yoga before we wrap up. This is a really important point. So our asana practice has come out of hatha yoga, which is about 1,000 years old. You date it to about 15th century.
Yeah,
sort of maybe 500 years earlier.
This is a huge debate. This is a huge debate as to as to how many asanas existed when, but yeah, go on. Generally,
Generally, Hatha Yoga has arisen in sort of the last 1,000 years, sorry, in the last 1,000 years. But the way that it was practiced prior to the 20th century is very different to how we practice it now. And those two things are almost at odds, aren't they?
That's exactly the key point. Something happened, and I don't have a clear scholarly argument on this yet, but I can give good reference points for it for your listeners. The two main books that they want to look at are Yoga Body by Singleton and Yoga in Modern India by Joseph Alter. But something happened around the turn of the 20th century in India that encouraged those who were interested in yoga to begin to, I would say, scientize it, begin to make it coherent with biomedical practice, begin to speak about it in terms of therapy, and to slowly strip it of some of its mystical and especially its tantric meanings. And this happened in the ashrams of Sri Yogendra, Swami Kuvalyananda, and then eventually in the experimental practices of T. Krishnamacharya and his students. And I think this is speculation on my part, but I think what happened was that the vocabulary of Hatha Yoga movement practices that existed in the cultural memory of India at the turn of the 20th century were suddenly transformed or rebranded as a kind of therapeutic vocabulary, and then also a number of the more radical, mortifying cleansing practices, especially those that are described in Hatha Yoga Pradipika, were either stripped out or they were sort of pushed to the side. People spoke about them in hushed tones, and really the project was part of this national or a proto-nationalist renaissance of bodily health within Indian political culture that really wanted yoga to be a globalizable therapeutic force that could stand as a sign of the ancient wisdom of Vedic and Indian culture. And so that's a very, very complex story, but I think the nuts and bolts of it are that Hatha Yoga went, within a very short period of time, from being a catabolic, an ascetic, a breaking down practice for human beings, for a very distinct class of human beings who wanted to escape the bonds of human reality altogether, and that it flipped in a very short period of time to being considered a therapeutic art form. And the way in which that happened is a fascinating story that a lot more research has to be done. But I think we have that broad picture. And I also think that there isn't a clear breakage between the two things, because when we hear people like the late Patabi Joyce say, even with heat, even iron will bend, and using metallurgical metaphors for describing the relationship between tapas and the flexibility or the mobility of the body. He's drawing on a very old poetic literature that describes the body as being instrumental to a transcendent experience, something that must be burned, that must be brought to the blacksmith, as it were, for forging into something new.
So when there was that rebranding of Hatha Yoga as something where you kind of not quite went to war with your body and then transcended it, but there was that rebranding to yoga or Hatha postures as therapy, some of the vestiges of that old way of interacting with postures continued through, and like you said, they're at odds with each other.
They're totally at odds with each other, and I think they absolutely continued through, and it's not surprising that they did, because let's face it, even today, most human beings have, as I've said, an ambivalent set of relationships with their flesh. We look at ourselves in distrust. We are surrounded by images of bodily perfection that make us feel intense shame. The body is a battleground, both prior to the 20th century and today, in which people strive to transcend themselves. So it's not like there's some, it's not like there's that the students of Krishnamacharya pulled one over on everybody and tried to Trojan horse old Hatha Yoga ideals into a modern therapeutic context. I think that the language just existed in the culture. It wasn't sufficiently probed or questioned. People probably weren't aware of it and its impacts upon them. And then as it globalizes, it also picks up and resonates with this very common human ambivalence we have about our happiness at being bodies, our happiness or unhappiness. I think we're in a constant struggle to accept ourselves, to feel pleasure, to mitigate our pain, and then to deal with the existential reality of our mortality. And that's what Hatha Yoga is really good for. Those guys were asking those questions all many years ago, all those centuries ago, and their answer was to say, let's go for it. Let's use this body in a very amazing, crazy, I would say almost jackass-like way, if the American TV show, to transcend, to stimulate nervous system experiences that are explosive and that are blissful. Let's do it. Let's go for it. And I think the therapeutic approach says, let's slow down a little bit. Let's make things sustainable. But those two forces are at war, and they will be for a long time, I think.
Well, thank you so much, Matthew, for taking the time to talk to us. It's a fascinating topic, and I will link to all the different articles. There's 12 or 13 articles you've written to date. So you're collecting all of this material for a book. Any idea on when that might arrive? I've given myself a time frame for it because I know that I could go on for years, and there's other things that I want to work on, like the environment, for example. What I'm planning to do is this fall to try to raise some money through a crowdfunding project on Indiegogo or something like that, in order to buy myself a little bit of sabbatical time, but also pay for editing and my research assistant and some transcription, because there's lots and lots of interviews to transcribe. And I think what I'll tell potential readers then, who I hope will pre-order the book and help me out, that I'll be finished a year from that point. So I would say the fall of 2015. So the fall would be September or October for those of us in the Southern Hemisphere.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Our spring.
Yeah, that's spring. Yeah, springtime in New Zealand, a lovely time to pre-order a book.
Yeah.
And so that's what I hope. That's what I hope. And who knows? There might be some research trips that I have to do to India and other places as well. I don't know. I'm leaving myself open for that.
Thank you so much for the time.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks so much, and best wishes to your readers and to your listeners.